Dr. Leisman join us or not?
I
No.
just did.
You
Hello.
did. Okay. So, Dr. Leisman, the floor is yours.
Very good. So in which case, if I could have the next slide, actually the first slide. In the background, you see a picture of Haifa, which is the city. I'm about 15 minutes away. You're all cordially invited to turn up. The big tall urinal in the picture is where my lab is. I'm in the basement. The president is on top. That actually has something to do with what we're talking about, because I'm underground, and so therefore I'm more protected, whereas he's on the top floor and he's less. But I'm just a peon, and he is the president of the university. That having been said, let's have the next slide. And I will use compressed speech. We've already heard about VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Well, what I'm going to try to do in compressed speech in the short time available to us is to put these concepts together in terms of the context of neuroscience, is what we understand, both developmentally, both professionally, both as it relates to the aging process, and actually as it relates to work. Very quickly, can I have the next slide, please? Here we have an example of the concept of uncertainty. Most of the things that happen to us in life are relatively certain. That is, we do the same thing again and again, and I'm sorry for speaking so quickly. That is, we don't pay attention to the things that recur because the likelihood of our getting hurt is significantly less than if we don't know what's going on. So, for example, if you take here in Israel right now, the number of deaths, except for October 7th, the number of deaths that occur from terrorism is basically slim to nil. It almost never happens, and yet there is this perception that there's a fair degree of danger and potential damage. Actually, our road traffic accidents are pretty pathetic. We have roughly 1 death a day. It's about 350 in a 9 million population over the course of the year. So there's a great likelihood of getting hurt or actually dead from a motor vehicle accident than there is from terrorism, except for the recent events. And what we can do is we can parlay this into a number of applications, one of which is the issue of political uncertainty. Another is in terms of cognitive uncertainty of any kind. And what we can say is that with looking at oxygen absorption in the brain using functional magnetic resonance imagery, a big term, basically allowing us to take a look at brain images while the human is performing, we can actually look at how uncertainty is represented in the brain. Next slide, please. So given the nature of ambiguity and threat, can we actually measure the pathways that are highly associated with ambiguity and threat? And ambiguity and threat does not necessarily have to be physical, because as we will see in our definition of stress, which Selye defined as anything that is perceived as being physically and or psychologically injurious to the organism, any organism, we know that there are certain biological markers that are associated with that kind of ambiguity and threat, and largely it's associated with changes in the autonomic nervous system, including increases in blood pressure, heart rate, respiratory rate, pilomotor response, the hair standing on end, muscle tension, and an increase in a substance called adrenal corticotrophic hormone, ACTH, which is underneath what suppresses the immune system. And so we're immune compromised. We have all of these autonomic responses, and that gets in the way of decision making. Next slide, please. So developmentally, we have what are called small versus large world networks. Explain that. I have a new grandson. He's 6 months old. He operates on the basis of small world networks, which means one area of the brain concerns itself with a particular task, and another area of the brain concerns itself with a different task. That's probably what you guys have learned in Introduction to Psychology way back when. Unfortunately, big people behavior doesn't work that way. That is, what we try to do is we put together these mini networks into larger networks, and that allows us to behave effectively. So one example would be that if we want to look at language, well, no, language is not represented in the temporal areas in front of an area called the Sylvian fissure and behind it. It's actually represented in the entire brain, dependent upon what words that you hear. So there are different networks that are associated with legs as opposed to faces. And the same thing is also true with how we learn how to adapt to life. That is, we have automatic responses that create these networks, and they're pretty much lifelong. So any change in human behavior, any increase in resilience is going to penultimately be a consequence of how these networks are put together. Talk therapy can have an effect in that area. So too can mechanisms of learning how to be more resilient. Next slide, please, which we can do through virtual systems. And what we can see in this slide are histologies of a 5-day-old neonate as opposed to a 6-year-old child, as opposed to an adult. And you can see that the 5-day-old infant is more closely related to the adult than to the 6-year-old child. Why? Because in the case of the 6-year-old child, we're learning how to develop new networks. And because of the work of Rita Levi-Montalcini, who received the Nobel Prize for nerve growth factor, we know that if you don't use it, you lose it. Why is that? Because we need to automate human behavior as much as we possibly can. And whatever we don't use, whatever cells don't connect with each other, are disappeared. And that's the kind of model we see in the adult. Next slide, please. So stress causes dendritic expansion in the corresponding neurons within the orbitofrontal cortex here. And in the bottom, neurons in the infralimbic cortex lose distal dendritic branches with stress. Next slide, and it explains it much more clearly. Next slide, please. So here you have an example of normal interconnectivities in the normal portion, the upper portion of the slide. And underneath, with toxic stress, you see that there's a paucity of those interconnections, dendritic interconnections, in that area of the brain, that the prefrontal cortex, that involves decision-making, and also in the hippocampus, which involves memory. So memory and adaptability are going to be compromised as a consequence of stress. And stress is very easily defined in terms of lack of resilience. That is, resilient people do much better with handling stress than non-resilient people. So anything that is involved in our ability to foment mechanisms for reducing stress will affect resilience. Next slide, please. So here's an example of one of the very few laws in the behavioral sciences, the Yerkes-Dodson law, which means if you have a non-stress environment, you cannot function. If you have a overly high-stressed environment, you cannot function. So we're looking for an optimum level of stress for human arousal for us to perform optimally. Next slide, please. Here we've just put some concepts around that Yerkes-Dodson graph. And you can see the difference between boredom, which renders you pretty much inactive, and breakdown burnout is on the other side of that curve. And you'll, of course, have these slides to peruse at your own leisure later on. Next slide, please. So resilience is the ability, if we're going to put together what we've said so far, is the ability to cope with setbacks, adversity, and trauma. And a misconception about resilience that it's that you won't experience any difficulties. Hell no. We have difficulties every moment in life. What we don't have, many of us do not have, is the ability to cope with those difficulties in life. So resilience, in other words, refers to how one manages the stresses of life, whether we do it skillfully and successfully or not. And resilience helps in personal growth, gives a better and newer perspective to life, and makes you more efficient on the job. Next slide, please. The good Lord, in her infinite wisdom, definitely the she piece of the concept of a divinity, anyone who's been in divorce court knows why there's a female component to this, shows that if you do not handle your stress, you will get sick. If you do not handle getting sick, you will die. And so what we have is a built-in mechanism to get the hero, like a deus ex machina in a Greek play, to get the hero away from the stressful situation. Next slide, please. So resilience and neuroplasticity are complementary concepts. By neuroplasticity, we mean chemicals, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, that are associated with motor activity, with movement, and also with the ability to create new connections, new connectivities within the brain. We know that through neuroplasticity, we can achieve resilience. And neuroplasticity is how our brains get trained to change the neural networks, as we indicated previously, by growth and reorganization. These synaptic connections can be resynced by learning and rigorous training, which is underneath what we're talking about today. Next slide, please. So there are numerous brain structures that are involved in the resilience, one of which, of course, is the amygdala. And the amygdala is part of the brain that's most responsive to emotional behavior. So any kind of emotional behavior can be triggered by the amygdala, and the neurons which extend from the amygdala are triggered due to fear and stress. The object of the exercise in resilient people is to have the amygdala relatively quiet. That's what happens with automatic behavior. So if you do something that's nominally dangerous to other people, but not necessarily, you don't see it that way, which means you're used to it because you do it again and again, it won't trip off the amygdala. Next slide, please. So resilience, as we've indicated, implicates plasticity. Next slide, please. And plasticity relies on the neurobiological systems that underpin social fitness, physical stamina, endurance, as individuals flexibly adapt to diverse situations. Next slide, please. One of the ways that generate these chemicals, oxytocin in particular, is by social interconnectivity. It's one of the substances that's involved in mother-child interaction, for example. We fathers can have it as well, but it's significantly involved in mother-child interaction, and it's generated both through brain-derived neurotrophic factors, increases, as well as resonance effects between parent and child or parent and infant. And it's exactly the same chemical and also the same resilience that's involved in adult interpersonal relationships, especially on the jobs. So the plasticity component of resilience has two features. One is it's integrative and regulatory. It actually regulates the physiology. And the other factor is that it's time-based. Next slide. I'm running out of time, but I'll very quickly run through this. Regulation promotes flexible integration of system components into a functional whole, and regulation adopts a system perspective and describes how components of a system get together into a functional whole. Next slide, please. Next slide. We know that resilience is time-based. That is, it's time-bound and it's process-based, which means that it develops from simple to complex and from biological to mental. The entire system that we're talking about is a biological system that's based in the amygdala, it's time-based, it's process-based, and it's associated with social interaction. So social movements unfold in time when there are two or more participants involved, and they create a dance between two people. You can't dance. You have two left feet, so to speak, socially. You will not succeed in what it is that you're doing. Next slide. So resilience is social, it's time-based. Next slide, please. Next. Next. And there are a number of chemicals associated with. Next slide. And the last point that I really wanted to make about all of this and putting this into an overall physiological context is the issue of meaning. We human beings search for meaning. Is there any meaning in life? Quite frankly, no. The only purpose that we have in life is to produce fertile offspring. You don't do that, you're a dud. And that our children have our genes. So in fact, we actually do have eternal life. We want to discuss philosophy and theology. I'd love to do that, but not here. In any event, what we are talking about is seeking meaning. So we humans have the ability to give meaning to trauma, which utilizes collective cultural and religious myths that can build personal meaning through actions. In other words, why did this happen to me? I don't understand what God meant when this happened. So we seek meaning in being able to create and coalesce groups together. And it's the group that supports human interaction, and it's the group that supports resilience. It could be religious, it could be cultural, it could be business, it could be a membership organization, it could be the Masons. It doesn't make any difference what it is, Freemasons. It doesn't make any difference what it is. Next slide, please. So, in summary, William James, in The Will to Believe, considered that belief is an integral choice for resilience, enabling an individual to create personally meaningful reality, giving significance to trauma and hardship. Meaning introduces a future dimension to resilience, adding a time horizon beyond the remembered presence. The remembered presence is what primates have. We don't. What we have is oxytocin that supports resilience that's highly associated with social interaction. It's the social piece that's underneath what it is that we're talking about. Next slide. So neural structures that cohere into the affiliative brain are formed very, very early in sensitive periods In other words, you don't have effective parenting, you're going to have a problem with flexibility, and you're going to have a concomitant problem with resilience. Next slide, please. And that should end it for us. One last comment, and that is, we looked at MRIs of Palestinian and Israeli Jewish teenagers when they were looking at damage to the opposite group. We found that there was empathy, which lasted roughly for a couple of seconds. And beyond that, it became the affiliative group that supported resilience. We had no empathy for the opposite group. So social interaction neurologically is the key to resilience. And with that, any further depth, please get in touch. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. I need to indicate that Dr. Leisman is a scientific and research director of our institute. I think I need to explain that he is in charge of the validation of all the new technology and research. And more importantly, he is a very good friend. But you see, you have something in common with most of us. We are not too young. You are not too old either.
Speak to yourself.
But our age, we have same age, Imanam. At our age, we don't want to lose time. We want to contribute as much we can with the time we have, and we are not ready to compromise our reputation. That's why everything we do in the Mental Wellness Society, in all the activity, in JIRA, everywhere, if it is not based, not data-driven, but scientifically proven, we don't talk about it. And that's something very important to indicate.